Hello and welcome back to Sceptic Takeout, episode 8. In this episode we're going to be talking translations, and we're looking at some very different examples of the way religious texts are translated and interpreted. Remember to like and subscribe, and if you haven't done so already, you can go over and check out Sceptic Hangout, the weekly podcast I do with Richard Gill and Laura McGee, where we talk about a whole range of different topics. We always have so much fun, and we even have the occasional special guest joining us to keep us in line. So, translations. It seems obvious that the easiest way to transmit religious texts is to make them as accessible as possible. And the translation of religious texts has been going on for almost as long as religious texts have been written down. John Drane highlights this in the New Line Encyclopedia of the Bible. By the time of the New Testament, the Hebrew scriptures were already widely available in Greek in a translation known as the Septuagint from the 3rd century before the Common Era. It was also this translation that put the books in the order we have them today, along with some other books that are not found in modern Bibles and that are sometimes printed separately and known as the Deuterocanonical books. With the exception of some Aramaic writings, the books of the Old Testament were originally written in Hebrew. But due to the environment and the fragile nature of the medium they were written on, very few ancient copies have survived. In fact, it wasn't until 1947 and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have had any manuscripts that predated the 9th and 10th centuries, and even then only contained the first 5 books of the Bible. It was translations that provided us with an accurate database by which we could cross-reference the accuracy of the copies of the Hebrew translations that we did have. In addition to the aforementioned Greek translations, we also had copies translated into Latin, known as the Vulgate, commissioned by Pope Damasus in 382 of the Common Era, and primarily translated by St. Jerome. Syriac, known as the Peshitta, possibly around the 2nd century of the Common Era, and in wide circulation from the 5th century onwards, and finally Egyptian or Sahidic Coptic from the 3rd to the 5th centuries of the Common Era. This is also an important translation for another reason. As well as preserving the original Hebrew Old Testament, which we can use as a reference to the accuracy of the ongoing copyists throughout the Middle Ages, it also serves as an insight into the latest developmental stages of the Egyptian language. It wasn't just the Jewish and Christian traditions that relied on the translations of the scriptures to help them be preserved and understood. Almost 3,000 miles away in northern India, Buddhism was undergoing its own preservation process through the means of multiple languages. The early Buddhist texts were originally transmitted, not unlike the early biblical texts orally, by a number of Middle Indo-Aryan languages known collectively as Prakrit, early Eastern Indo-Aryan known collectively as Magadhan, and most famously Pali, and first written down in the 1st century before the Common Era. As with the translation of the Hebrew scriptures, we are fortunate that we have translations into another language where we can cross-reference the text with the Pali versions. For Buddhism, this other language was Chinese in the texts known as the Agamas. These texts are often compared to the Pali Nikayas by scholars to try and understand where possible changes may have been made and how authentic the texts are in relation to early Buddhism. Individual translators of these early texts are often harder to trace, and once again it's the Chinese that come to the rescue for the modern scholar. Jan Nattier explains in her 2008 paper, A Guide to the Earliest Chinese Buddhist Translation, The evaluation of any attribution to a Chinese text to a translator who lived prior to the 6th century of the Common Era must begin, though it certainly does not end, with the evidence contained in the oldest extant catalogue of Buddhist translations, the Chu Shan Sang Ziji, compiled by Sengyao, completed circa 515 of the Common Era. Sengyao's catalogue itself incorporated an earlier work by Daoan, although the earlier work is now lost. Interestingly, these aren't the only important contributions that China made to the world in relation to the Buddhist text. SilkRoad.com states, the first mentioning of printing is an imperial decree from 593 AD, in which the Shu Emperor Wenti orders Buddhist images and scriptures to be printed. And in fact, the world's earliest dated book is another important Buddhist text, dating from 11th of May 868 of the Common Era. The Diamond Sutra is a Mahayana text and was found in the Magao Caves, also known as the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas, in the Gansu province of China. This, of course, wasn't the only occurrence of printing being important in the transmission of religious texts, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Nowhere in religious studies is the issue of translation talked about as much as in Islam. Almost universally, Muslims will tell you that you can't fully appreciate the Quran, if not understand its meaning at all, unless you are able to read it in its original Arabic. What many of them don't tell you, however, and what many of them aren't even aware of, is that the collection that we now know as the Quran took hundreds of years to reach its final form, and even made structural changes to written Arabic in doing so. Before we go into the details, let us consider the challenge in the Quran to produce a chapter like it. And if you are in doubt about what we have revealed, the Quran, to our worshipper Muhammad, then produce a chapter like it, and call your witnesses, supporters and helpers, besides God if you are truthful. And if you do not do it, and you can never do it, then fear the fire of hell, whose fuel is men and stones. It has been prepared for disbelievers. And give good news, O Muhammad, to those who believe and do good deeds, that for them are gardens, paradise, in which rivers flow. This challenge is clear. The Quran must be from God, because no man could produce a chapter like it. It is, according to the Muslim, literary perfection. The difficulty with this is obvious. Who is going to be the judge of this? And what are the criteria for the tests? We're not going to delve too deeply into this challenge. I just wanted to bring it to your attention and bear it in mind as we talk about how the early Quran was actually put together. But it is worth noting that, as with many details about Islam, it is not easy to find impartial historical sources to verify the claims made by either Muslims or their detractors. The specific criteria that I have found for this test is oft repeated, but without, it seems, any reliable source. See my Best of Men episode 2, Muhammad episode, for more on the difficulty of finding reliable, impartial historical sources within Islam. Links in the description. The challenge proposed by the Quran aside, there is another challenge we face when we're studying the history of the Quran, and that is for Muslims exploring the history of the Quran in itself can be to call it into question. The form of the Quran isn't, as many Muslims would have us believe, unique, but it is a reflection of the rich oral tradition and pre-Islamic poetry that are the best surviving literature prior to the Quran. In his series of lectures produced for the Great Courses entitled Introduction to the Quran, Professor Martin Oliver explains, it's important to remember that the Quran was not composed as modern books were. It began as an oral phenomenon. When it came time to write a book down, the oral character of the text remained a feature, not a book. Contrary to Islamic tradition, the Quran we have today is not perfect and unchanged since the time of Muhammad. We have fragmentary writings from the Quran from within 50 years of Muhammad's death, and partial manuscripts from the early 8th century. There are two scripts that early Qurans were written in. These are the Hijazi and Kufic scripts. Both lack the linguistic markings that we see in later Qurans. It was around 150 years after the death of Muhammad that these two scripts gave way to the script we are more familiar with in the Quran. These markings were inserted to better allow the written Quran to follow the form of the traditional poetic recitation of the oral transmission. Of course, the writing and copying of the Quran wasn't a straightforward process by any means, and in his corrections in early Quran manuscripts, Dr. Daniel Brubaker gives an explanation of what is meant by correction. In a correction, something is added, removed, replaced, or perhaps hidden. Corrections can be classified in other ways, but these terms summarize the mechanics of the matter. Brubaker has analysed approximately 10,000 early Quranic manuscript folios, and it is interesting that he notes regarding the standardized version of the Quran by Uthman ibn Affan, who reportedly burnt variant copies to preserve the correct form of the text. It is odd that no copy existing today has been reliably identified as one of these actual authoritative copies, and that the ones about which such a claim is made seem to have been produced long after Uthman's time. We know that parts of the Quran we have today were in wide circulation early in Islamic history, but it is also obvious that the claim that the Quran is perfect and unchanged since Muhammad's time is nothing but the repeated tradition of the believer, with no scholarly evidence to back up the claim. In fact, Oliver states plainly, from a historian's point of view, it is reasonable to conclude that the final version of the Quran is the result of human effort. It was collated and collected, and perhaps edited, by people working in the wake of Muhammad's legacy. Indeed, many elements of the text that are today assumed, chapter divisions and titles, verse numbers and indicators, are ipso facto inventions. In light of these changes, the challenge the Quran makes seems somewhat less daunting. While Muslims claim that the challenge cannot be met, they do so on the basis that Quran is perfect, unchanged word of God, and this, as we have seen, is evidently not the case. But what has this got to do with translation? Well, that's quite obvious. Because it is held to be perfect, any translation renders the text imperfect, and thus Islamic apologists hold that any translation is prone to error. And this, as we shall see later on, is a major apologetic in Islam to those verses which might prove difficult to a modern audience. We have already talked briefly about the Buddhist translations in antiquity and how, like the Greek texts in the Christian tradition, the Chinese translations offered insights into the original texts of the Pali Nikayas. But Buddhism, probably more so than any of our other examples, has a hugely rich and fluid past. Indeed, it is this traditional variety that allowed Buddhism to spread and flourish as it went from India to China, Vietnam, Burma and Sumatra, to Japan, Korea and Tibet, and finally made its way to the West. Where it is true that secular Western Buddhism bears little resemblance to its origins in the foothills of the Himalaya, it is also true that elements of most Buddhist traditions have borrowed hugely from the countries that it passed through down the years. But these local customs aren't the only things that have affected the translations of the Buddhist texts. Indeed, this is something that should be taken into account for all translations of religious texts. The bias of the translator should also be considered. To demonstrate what I mean, I'm going to compare three short passages of the Dhammapada, two from practicing Buddhist monks from very close traditions, and one from a scholar of the Vedic texts. Ajahn Menindo, a senior monk of the Thai forest tradition, opens up chapter 26 of the Dhammapada with the following verse: "Diligently cut off the stream of craving and abandon sensual longings. Knowing the limitation of all that is formed, realize the uncreated." Tanisaro, a monk of the same tradition, translated the same verse as follows: "Having striven Brahman, cut the stream, expel sensual passions, knowing the ending of fabrications, Brahman, you know the unmade." Before we go into the third translation, I want to look at some reasons behind the way these two variants were rendered the way that they were. But before we do that, we need to take note of the text itself. We can take some valuable information from the postscript of Menindo's translation by Thomas Jones, where he tells us, "The sayings and poems of the Dhammapada were written in verse consisting of 4 and 6 line stanzas, with lines of 8 or 11 syllables. Such forms belong to ancient Indian literary tradition and lend to the text a distinctive rhythm. This rhythmic constraint necessitated the finding of words of the right number of syllables to fit the lines, the effect of which is a multiplicity and vigour in the language not found in the prose scriptures. There is therefore a formality in the Pali verse, which, like most poetry, is untranslatable." Now we know the form of the original Pali text. What is it that influenced the decisions to translate the text the way the two practicing monastics did? Menindo's text tries to catch the spirit rather than the form of the text, while also taking into account the modern audience. For example, references to the more supernatural elements of the original Buddhist text have been replaced with modern psychological equivalents. Tanisaro's introduction to his translation is thorough and picks no bones about the number of translations of the text that have been attempted. He says, "Many other English translations are already available. The fingers of at least 5 people would be needed to count them. So I suppose that a new translation has to be justified to prove that it's not just another one." From the outset, he lays down his intent. Of course he is correct about one thing in particular. The Dhammapada was the first Buddhist text to be translated in Europe in 1855 with both English and Latin translations, and has had up to at least 30 English translations since. More so than Menindo, Tanisaro tries to preserve the Pali terms, especially, as he points out in his introduction, where the terms have a technical meaning. But his overall goal is clear. The explanatory material is designed to meet with the needs of two sorts of readers: those who want to read the texts as a text, in the context of the religious history of Buddhism, viewed from the outside, and those who want to read the text as a guide to the personal conduct of their lives. Although there is no clear line dividing these groups, the introduction is aimed more at the second group, and the historical notes more at the first. So even here, within the same tradition, the biases at work between two translators come to bear on the way the text is rendered, where one seeks to convey the essence of the text, even going as far as to swap out elements of Buddhist cosmology for modern psychological terminology. The other wants to present a more traditional translation, though still being accessible to a non-Buddhist audience. And it is here, with our third translation, that we see the real difficulty in communicating religious texts from their original language or languages. Our third translation, it can be argued, is, from the perspective of the scholarly students, by far the most qualified. When Mascaro lectured at Oxford, was a vice principal of Parameshvara College at Jaffna, a Hindu school, and was a professor of English at the University of Barcelona before becoming a supervisor in English at Cambridge University. His translation of the same verse goes, "Go beyond the stream, Brahmin. Go with all your soul. Leave desires behind. Where you have crossed the stream of samsara, you will reach the land of nirvana." We notice several glaring differences between this academic translation and the two preceding translations immediately. And the first line to the introduction of Mascaro's translation itself offers some insight into why these differences may be so obvious. It reads, "The Pali word Dharma corresponds to the Sanskrit Dharma, the first word of the Bhagavad Gita." This immediately shows us the major bias in this text, and I will explain why this is such a difficulty shortly. That bias is that Mascaro was primarily a translator of Hindu, not Buddhist texts. The reason this is so problematic is presented most obviously at the end of the first line of text. In his rendering, Mascaro tells the reader to go with all their soul. Why is this such a problem? Because in Buddhism, quite simply, there is no soul as we understand it, both in the West or as they understood it in Hinduism. Now, this isn't the video where we need to go into the nuances of what different traditions consider the soul to be. Suffice it to say that from the Buddhist perspective, this is entirely incorrect. And from the perspective of the reader with no previous understanding of Buddhism, entirely misleading. There are a couple of technical terms in the final line of this verse which might also cause confusion to the reader, encountering Buddhism for the first time, and interestingly left out of both of the translations rendered by the monastic Buddhists we have already looked at, whose audience would more than likely already understand them. These are samsara and nirvana. Samsara can be translated as moving about or wandering, but in the larger picture refers to the wheel of rebirth in Buddhist cosmology. Nirvana is the Sanskrit form of the Pali nibbana, and has various Pali meanings including being free from craving, cooling or extinction, as in a fire being put out. In Buddhism, it refers to the final bliss of being free from the bonds of samsara. Notice how the Buddhist monastics render this as uncreated and unmade, and avoid the term nirvana altogether. So the bias of the translators in the case of the Dhammapada is evident, and in this case in particular, it is very interesting how the scholar, the one most inclined to a technical translation, has let his bias towards the Hindu interpretation of certain words entirely mistranslate the context of the word from the Buddhist perspective. This is one example of how even the most educated can make mistakes, while at the same time being technically correct when it comes to the religious texts. But in the next section, we're going to look at how translating texts can in fact do the opposite and present a wider audience with a greater understanding of the works being translated as we dive into Christianity. It is no secret that literacy in the medieval period was low, but what is not as commonly known is that there was a rich history of administrative practice throughout Europe in the later Middle Ages. What is probably not a surprise is that many of these administrators were from a monastic background. As is pointed out in A Companion to the Medieval World, edited by Carol Lansing and Edward English, it tells us literacy became largely confined to churchmen educated in bishopric or monastic schools. Kings depended upon ecclesiastical scriptoria for their early experiments in pragmatic literacy, and the earliest royal chancellors were often bishops. The multiplication of schools long depended upon the conversion of Europe, and the founding of bishoprics and monasteries, augmented from the 12th century by the early growth of universities, elite institutions of clerical education, remained of the greatest importance for the higher branches of administration throughout the Middle Ages. Senior administrators were commonly drawn from ranks of the upper clergy until well into the early modern period. While it is true that literacy was increasing, especially among the clergy and up-and-coming young noblemen, a change was afoot. In the 1450s, something happened that revolutionized literacy, and partially on the back of this, Christianity itself would shortly enter a new period. It had been almost 600 years since the world's first dated book with the Chinese Buddhist Diamond Sutra, and in Mainz, Germany, Johann Gutenberg was about to make an even bigger leap in literary history. The Gutenberg Bible was printed using movable metal type and was the forerunner to the revolution of printed, widely available books in the West. While Gutenberg didn't invent printing, and indeed more amalgamated existing ideas rather than inventing a wholly new device, he certainly revolutionized it. This was perfect timing, being less than 100 years before Luther, another German, translated his own German language version of the Bible from Hebrew and Ancient Greek in 1534. Luther, of course, is better known for being instrumental in the great Christian schism known as the Reformation, and there seems to be no doubt that Gutenberg's printing press played a role in this by allowing the Bible to be accessible far and wide to those not confined to the administrators which had come out of the monastic schools. It wasn't Luther's German rendition of the Bible that was to have the greatest impact on the Reformation, though. While Martin Luther's complete Bible had been published in 1534, his New Testament was published in 1522, and this preceded by 3 years, arguably the most important translation of the Bible since St. Jerome completed his translation of the Bible into Latin in 405 of the Common Era. In 1525, William Tyndale produced a Bible that not only marked some remarkable milestones, it was the first to take advantage of the printing press, the first of the English Bibles of the Reformation, and the first English Bible to refer to God as Jehovah, which is a problematic case of translation error in itself. That's for another episode. What was most important about Tyndale's Bible was that it laid the foundation and was the main translation used for all Bibles using early modern English, including the King James Version, published in 1611. The impact of the King James Version of the Bible cannot be underestimated. From conception to publishing it took 7 years, with 3 of those being editing, overseen by Archbishop Richard Bancroft. It became the standardized version of the Bible for the English-speaking world and influenced art, music, language. Following the Reformation and the ideals and theology of Luther and those like him, the Bible became a gateway to literacy for those not confined to the clergy or monastic communities. The instigators of the Reformation wanted all people to have access to the scriptures in their own languages, and for the people of the English-speaking world, in the King James Version of the Bible, that vision started to become a reality. Some 350 years after the publication of the King James Version of the Bible, on August 27, 1965, after a 2-day conference at Trinity Christian College, Palos Heights, Illinois, it was decided that a contemporary English translation of the Bible was needed, and a commission was set up to oversee the work. This all stemmed from a business trip in which Howard Long tried sharing the gospel with an associate, only for his efforts to be responded to with laughter. His associate wasn't laughing at the Christian message. Indeed, he didn't understand it. He was laughing at the archaic language which he was being proselytized to in. Fast forward to 1978 and the New International Version, or NIV, was published. It took 13 years, over 100 scholars overseen by a committee of 15, translating directly from original Greek, Hebrew and Aramaic texts to produce an English translation that could be understood by everyone in the modern English-speaking world. Not a thou shalt not to be seen. The NIV was groundbreaking and opened up the door for many more contemporary biblical translations. These days, in 2021, we don't need to rely on a decade of scrupulous scholarship, of course. With the advent of the internet, we have biblical resources of all sorts of quality at our fingertips. Websites like BibleGateway.com provide as many as 232 different translations in 74 different languages, and while many of these undoubtedly fall prey to the bias of the translators, either as we saw in the last chapter through good intentions, or as we are about to see through deliberate twisting of the text to suit a particular narrative, these Bible hubs provide a valuable resource for accessing and comparing different translations. From the first unified translation of the Bible by St. Jerome to the revolution in the written word that was allowed by the invention of Johann Gutenberg's printing press, translation has played an important role in how we view and assess religious texts. However, what we haven't touched on much yet is how it can all go horribly wrong when those translating the texts try to deliberately misrepresent what they say in order to paint unsavoury elements of those texts in a more palatable light. In Chapter 3, we looked at the bias of the author, despite them sincerely wanting to communicate the best translation they could, whether that be from scholarly perspective or, as in the case of Menindo's rendition, a more fluid spirit of the text. In this segment, in a way, we will again be looking at bias, but this time from an apologetic standpoint. That is, changing or focusing attention on a specific word or phrase in order to change the meaning so that the text itself cannot be criticised by those outside the faith. In both the following examples, which are very different, one changes the phrasing in order to change the meaning, and the other specifically focuses on a specific word out of context. But the result is the same, a deliberate attempt to render the instructions in the text more favourably to a modern audience. So let's look at Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall's 2004 translation of the Qur'an and his treatment of one of the most controversial verses in the text, Surah 4, An-Nisa, verse 34. As I did with the Dhammapada, I am going to use 3 variant translations in order to get a full and fair picture as possible. Trigger warning, this next section deals with spousal abuse, so if this is uncomfortable for you, please skip this section to the conclusion. There are many obvious flaws from the secular viewpoint. It's in the whole verse, and we could probably do a full video on the critique of it, but we are only concerned with one section for the purpose of this video. And for the following translations, I'll just refer to those particular sections. The versions that I will begin with are from the 2004 text of the Quran translated by Sahih International, followed by Dr. Muhammad Taqi ud-Din al-Hilali's 2000 translation. The Sahih International translation is as follows. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. Taqi ud-Din al-Hilali's translation follows. As to those women on whose part you see ill conduct, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last beat them, lightly if it is useful. Pickthall's version renders the verse, as for those from whom you fear rebellion, admonish them, and banish them to beds apart, and chastise them. I think by this point it has probably become obvious where the deliberate mistranslation lie. Pickthall's version has no reference to beating or striking the disobedient woman, and indeed contextually it makes no sense. Where the other 2 translations escalate the punishment to the wife, Pickthall seems to escalate to a point, then step back, which in light of the following verse, which states that if they obey you again you should leave them be, seems nonsensical. It seems no wonder that Pickthall's rendering is one of the most popular amongst English speakers, and from my personal perspective, has been the one repeatedly recommended by Muslim friends seeking to cast Islam in a positive as light as possible. This apologetic may be less surprising when you discover that Pickthall was a convert from Christianity, and was writing as an Englishman for an English-speaking audience. That he wanted to cover up the more unsavoury elements of the Quran by, well, simply mistranslating them is not a tremendous surprise. It is immensely dishonest, but a surprise? Not really. The next apologetic concerning mistranslation stems from a long-form conversation I had over several weeks with an apologist around the Hebrew word tafas, which in isolation means to catch, handle, lay hold, take hold of, seize or wield. I want to repeat the trigger warning here. I will be talking about rape, so once again, if you want to skip this section, please feel free to jump to the conclusion. He was trying to argue that in relation to Deuteronomy 22:25, the word does not mean to rape. based solely on the direct translation of the word. My response was that taking a word in isolation without context to those words around it can be confusing and even nonsensical. To evidence this, I presented him the translation from the NIV version, which is one of the most thoroughly checked renditions of the Bible for accuracy. It says, "But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die." His rebuttal was, well, simply that his translation of the word in isolation trumped the biblical scholars who had spent years studying the language and translating the Bible. I kid you not, that was his defense. Rather than relaying the nuances of the entire discussion here, I'm going to demonstrate how translating a single word in isolation completely removes coherence from the entire passage. To do this, I picked a French language book at random and sent a friend of mine the text to translate for me. On screen is an excerpt from the cover of Le Diable au Corps by Raymond Radigeau from 1923. I then went into a popular online translator, translating a single word at a time in isolation, exactly as the apologist had suggested that we do with the biblical text. Here is the result. Then that the First War world beats his full. A teenager of 15 years starts at idle passionate with a wife of 3 years his elder. Fiancé at a soldier left at forehead. Well far off trenches, the lover taste of happiness as well intense egoist. The following is a translation by my multilingual friend Andrew Jones, who holds a master's degree in linguistics of the same text. As the First World War reaches a hiatus, a 15-year-old adolescent begins a passionate relationship with a woman 3 years his senior. Fiancé to a soldier sent in the front lines, far from the trenches, the lover's taste of happiness is intense as it is selfish. The conclusion is obvious. Trying to use an isolated translation of a word to excuse things that you think people will disagree with from your holy book is wholly nonsensical. Not only does it make you dishonest when you are fully aware of the context of the verse, but it also only takes a marginal tug for the whole appalling argument to fall flat on its face. In both of the cases we've just examined, we've seen examples of apologists deliberately misleading their audience in order to justify religious texts that have no place in the modern world. We could go on and on about translations, whether I present a complete history of the biblical translations, which we've only scratched the surface of here, or talk about Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham, possibly one of the most embarrassing faux pas of the history of translated religious texts, and unfortunately still argued as authentic by some modern Latter-day Saints. It is a subject that can be expanded upon almost indefinitely. As we have seen, translating a religious text isn't just a case of copying them word by word into another language. Religious texts are made up of a blend of history, poetry, allegory, creation myths, folklore and interpretation. Getting the context correct is not easy, even for scholars. We have seen during the course of this episode that such attention to detail needs to be read with as much context as possible. Reading simply from the aspect of an apologist trying to defend your faith can, and as we have seen does, lead to some erroneous conclusions. And if your intent is to pass that information on as a religious leader or educator, then you should be willing to stand up and be countered when those mistakes are pointed out. Of course, it's not just the believers that are prone to getting it wrong when it comes to reading translations of religious texts. Very often critics will ignore the context of the stories themselves, mistaking allegory as history or reading scholarly speculation as facts. The truth is, there is more than one way to read a religious text, and whether it is textual criticism as a religious practitioner or simply as a critic, we should familiarise ourselves with as much as possible, with as many facts as possible, in order to understand the text fullest way possible. It is vital that we understand that there is more than one way to read and understand a text, and which translation, whether it be a modern translation or an early translation within more academic pursuits, we read can make all the difference to that understanding, which shows why the study of textual translation has remained fascinating and vital for almost as long as the texts themselves have been written down. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and join me next time when we explore episode 9, The Best of Men, episode 3, The Buddha. In the meantime, you can catch me weekly on Sceptic Hangout podcast, and please check out my friends all linked in the description below. See you next time.